Hello, I'm Alistair Upton. I'm the Chief Executive of Creative Folkestone, and I'd like to welcome you here today to Autumn Reads Modern Nature. This is our virtual festival in which we're bringing you a range of activities based around the diaries that Derek Jarman wrote at Prospect Cottage 1989 to 1990. We do hope you enjoy the festival, and we'd like to thank you for your continued support of Creative Folkestone.
Hello there, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for this Autumn Reads Sunday brunch session with Francis Tophill and four of Folkestone's finest gardeners. I'm Greg Taylor. Today we're going to be talking about the allotment, gardens, rewilding projects and wild spaces of Folkestone. I'm joined by Francis Tophill, horticulturalist, broadcaster, conservationist and author. Francis will be talking about her new book, Rewired Your Garden. We will then meet some of Folkestone's own gardening superstars. We have Helen Linden, an artist who's been rewilding her own garden for the last 2 years. Susie Ashworth of Folkestone Harbour Yarn, who is also caretaker of the Payer's Pocket Garden, tucked away behind the courthouse. We also have Ginny Mitchell, a nature and garden leader who is responsible for all sorts of community gardening projects in the town and in local schools. And finally, we have Phil Green, former site warden for the White Cliffs Countryside Partnership, wildlife gardener and all-round font of knowledge on local wildlife in our area. I'm here as coordinator of Urban Room Folkestone. We're located in the harbour area of the town. The Urban Room is a place to come and learn about the past, present and future of Folkestone, collectively planning what goes on in the town. We crucially seek to be an impartial host for discussions between people with ideas for the town, decision makers and the wider public. It's a space for the exchange of ideas. As part of last year's Salt Festival of the Sea and Environment, the Urban Room hosted several events that led to discussions about guerrilla gardening and how this might happen in Folkestone. We're hoping that today might actually be a launch pad for such things. As someone without my own garden to work with, my actual gardening experience is limited, but I was lucky enough to be part of the Salt Shingle Garden Group in 2016. We created a garden from all the plants growing in the Harbour Arm area before it was redeveloped into what it is today. And we were lucky enough to have the expert advice of Francis Tophill for our group. So today we're joined by Francis. Her book Rewired Your Garden's recently been released. It's a real pleasure to read. It's filled with all sorts of information about individual wildlife species, how they all relate, what to plant to support them, and even how-to guides for all sorts of crucial wildlife features. It's all underpinned by a certain level of activism that says we should all have a go at doing something to help wildlife in our area. And it's filled with lots of beautiful illustrations too. I'll be handing over shortly to Francis, who will talk about her book. She'll then be followed by a short presentation from each of our four guests, before all five of our speakers have a conversation together. They'll be ready to answer any questions, so please do submit them in the chat next to the stream. And I'll hand over to Francis now.
Thank you, Greg. Hello, everybody. Yes, so just to give you a kind of background on what this was originally going to be a tour of Folkestone, talking about the species that were there and how they're helpful and what we can do to harness those. But I now have 10 minutes. So what I did was I walked on the tour and took lots of photos as I went, which I'll discuss as we go through. All with a kind of view to talk about wildlife gardening and rewilding. And yes, as Greg said, subtle activism about what we can all be doing, which I think is something. So if we go on to the next slide or the first slide, then you can see the beginnings of the plant species. So basically, what I'll do is I walked along the top of the Folkestone cliffs and I took photographs of essentially what is weeds, and then moved on to cultivated plants. We were going to feature some gardens on the tour, but I just walked on the sort of public areas and looked at cultivated plants. And then I finally looked at where these plants are kind of guerrilla gardening all by themselves and just coming in and taking over wild or unused spaces, which happens all over the world and happens all over our towns and cities and countryside. And it's just recognizing them and recognizing the value that those species can bring in order to then hopefully start cultivating them and giving them a little bit more credit, because some of these are undervalued species. So this is obviously nettle. This is a stinging nettle. There are different kinds of stinging nettles. There are also dead nettles and red dead nettles. But as a general group of plants, they are absolutely crucial to wildlife. These are great for moths and butterflies, specifically things like red admirals and peacocks and commas. They all feed on the nettles, and many species of butterfly lay their eggs on nettles as well. Also, lots of aphids and lots of ladybirds will use nettles. So if you want to encourage birds into your garden, then these are really good things to grow, just to have that whole ecosystem of different kinds of wildlife. But as well as that, because I think this whole approach to gardening, when we talk about rewilding in countryside, it doesn't really matter what a place looks like as much, whereas in gardens we like things to be aesthetically nice and also useful to us. And nettle is one of those plants that is incredibly useful to us. It's a food source which is high nutrition. It's full of all the different antioxidants that you can get. Excuse the barking dog, that is that's just part of being here, unfortunately. Yeah, so full of all the antioxidants, vitamins A, C and K, iron, potassium, magnesium, amino acids. It's full of goodness, and also phosphorus, and that's really useful to gardeners as well. Potassium and phosphorus are key nutrients, so using nettles as part of a compost gives a really rich compost to feed our other crops as well. So it's a really useful plant, and medicinally for inflammations, so for arthritis or skin conditions, for hay fever it's really good because it builds up all the histamines, antihistamines, as well as lots of things. So nettle is a fantastic plant, hugely underrated, hugely undervalued, but hugely useful and important for wildlife. So next slide. Okay, this is a member of the Umbellifer family, so it's probably an Angelica. It's quite hard to tell at this time of year. These are really useful plants, but I've included them because they can have a slightly tenuous or questionable reputation. A lot of them are, mainly the hemlocks, very poisonous. So having them, it's kind of a warning really with all of this, to really do your research and get to know what you're looking at. The Alexanders, Angelicas, cow parsley, sweet Sicily are all edible, really useful, really delicious. The Umbellifer family are all fantastic for wildlife. You'll recognise them mainly in May and June when they have lovely flat white flowers usually. Fantastic for pollinators, but proceed with caution because it can be really hard to tell the difference between a hemlock and a sweet Sicily, for example. So it's just a kind of little cautionary tale to have a look at what's around you and then really research it and make sure you know exactly what it is before you start going and foraging or cultivating things in your gardens. Next slide, please. Bramble. We all know this, and it has a really bad reputation for good reason. It can be a complete thug. In a rewilding scheme, I've included this because it's such a key primary colonizer of the landscape. I've heard people say the reason that we don't just let nature do its own thing is because of brambles, because they'll take over. And that is true, they will take over. But the whole, as I mentioned in my book, rewilding is not just a short-term solution. It literally takes thousands of years for the planet to wild itself. And bramble is a primary colonizer, as is grass and nettles and lots of other species that we think of as weeds. And they have a really valuable function in that process. So what brambles will do is they'll take a wasteland bit of ground from the ground level upwards. They'll start scrambling up walls. They'll bring things in a more vertical growth pattern, which will then allow things like nesting for birds and places for mammals to hide and to create their homes as well. Hugely valuable for a food source. So the berries are really nutritious. The flowers, it's in the rose family, so it has lovely, useful flowers for pollinators. But it will take over. Having said that, once it's taken over, the shady areas at the base of the bramble will provide a really good habitat for things like small tree species or fern species, and that will begin to grow, and then the landscape will begin to diversify, and over, as I said, thousands of years, you'll probably eventually have a mixed or deciduous woodland in the UK. It takes a long time, and it's just that understanding that when we have these little patches of land, if we rewild them ourselves, even if we live in them for our whole lives and have the same garden from when we're born to when we die, that's probably going to be less than a century. And in the grand scheme of things, in a rewilding scheme, that's a tiny fraction of time. So it's kind of about patience and about understanding the processes of rewilding. And as gardeners, we have to manage that. So we are rewilding, we are creating these spaces, but we're then harnessing them a little bit more to our own needs as well. So let the brambles grow, harvest the fruits, make jams, make puddings with them, but then obviously dig them up when they are beginning to take over a little bit too much and keep them in check in a garden setting. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, this is mallow. This is common mallow. It's a really, really useful species for solitary bees and all kinds of bees. But solitary bees get a bit of a, not a bad press, but they are undervalued. We think of honeybees when we think of bees, but solitary bees actually do an awful lot more of the pollination of our species in this country. So mallow is a great provider of food source for solitary bees. Also medicinally really good topically now for things like bronchitis, throat infections, coughs, asthma. So anything like that, mallow is a really good source of healing. And also as food, you can use it in salads, you can use it as a spinach alternative, or I have heard of people using it as a kind of alternative to poppadoms if you shallow fry the really big leaves. I've not tried it myself, but I think I will. It's a really beautiful species as well, but it's a great one for anyone living by the coast, so anyone in Folkestone or any other coastal town. Mallow is a really good, really useful and really beneficial weed to allow to grow. Next slide, please. This is tamarisk, again, a fantastically useful plant for coastal dwellers. You can see the vague essence of the sea in the background of that picture. It grows really tall. It's a really good species for providing nesting, covered with flowers, mainly in the spring, but a lot of them are actually flowering again now because we've had such a strange weather this year. So really good for pollinators and just really useful for anyone wanting to create an ecosystem in a coastal environment where maybe not a lot else will grow. Next slide, please. Okay, another slight warning. So this is something called Petrocytes. It's a winter heliotrope, and it's a classic example of where rewilding without the adequate research can maybe go a bit wrong. So this is an invasive species. It's got a lovely scented winter flower, not particularly useful, but if you plant it, you'll find it's absolutely impossible to get rid of, and it spreads entirely through your whole garden. So it's just a little lesson as I was walking along the cliff there, just to say, be careful what you put out, especially in the countryside, but in your own garden as well, because one wrong plant, if you don't make sure it's something that's going to work in harmony and in balance with the rest of our native flora, then you can have a big mistake on your hands. And that's one of them. It's the one with the sort of round leaves there. That's the winter heliotrope. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're on to the more cultivated areas. This is red valerian. It's not true valerian, so it doesn't have the medicinal qualities of valerian, but it is a really great plant for the coastal areas. It's really great for pollinators. It grows massively well. Again, it can maybe take over, but it's very easy to pull up if you feel it's getting too big for its boots. And it's just a very useful, lovely, wild-esque plant, but for a cultivated site. This is actually along the railway walk from the harbour arm, or the harbour out to the harbour arm that we created for the Salt Festival that Greg mentioned earlier on, and it's really come into its own this year. It's looking beautiful. Next slide, please. This is gorse. So I came across this a lot up on the cliff, and then this is it in a cultivated setting. It's a beautiful shrub filled with flowers, and crucially for gorse, if you're looking to encourage wildlife, it flowers all year round. And there's a really famous saying that when gorse is out of flower, kissing is out of fashion. So it's there all the time, and it's fantastic for bees. You can see from the shape of the flower, it's a pea family member. And it's got a really interesting shape, which is called zygomorphic, which basically has a mechanism by which bees can enter the flower and they open it for the first time. And when that happens, it sort of shoots out a bit of pollen that lands on the bee, and then they take it onto the next flower. So it's kind of a one-trick pony gorse. Once it's opened, it's done its thing. You can do it yourself, but I try not to do it to too many, because otherwise the bees lose their food source. But it's a really interesting plant, really valuable for bees. You can use it. You can use it to make a dye. You can use it to make a tea. It has a lovely sort of coconut scent when it's all out. It probably May, June time, maybe April will be when it's in its fullest glory. But it's a really, really great plant for wildlife, and a really, really good plant just in general for your garden, especially if you have a tough garden, very windy, exposed sites, very cold sites. It will be absolutely fine with. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry, this is a really out of focus picture. I hadn't realised it was getting quite dark. This is a plant with a very bad reputation. This is Ragwort. And the reason I've included it is because I have it growing on my allotment, and I've been told off by people that I need to dig it up whenever it goes on Gardener's World. If we film something, people write in and complain that we featured this plant. This is a really useful plant. It's the only plant that the cinnabar moth larvae can feed on. So without this plant, we will not get cinnabar moths, which is a beautiful red and black species. It's poisonous to livestock, which is why it has a bad reputation, but it's not one that we have to get rid of. There are no laws around it. Just be careful if you're making hay from a field that has ragwort in it, but otherwise let it grow. It's fantastic for pollinators, and it's poisonous, but so are many, many other plants. And to humans, it will do minimal damage. So it's a bad reputation plant that I wanted to give a little bit of a write-up to. Next slide, please. I will rush through because I'm going over a bit on time. Rosemary. Okay, fantastic. Good stimulant, antioxidant, anti-inflammatory, great for your hair, great for your skin. Really good as a food source, high in iron, but also really, really fantastic for wildlife. You can see this is flowering now. I took this a few days ago. It flowers for a lot of the year, and it's got that blue coloration that bees can see really well. So bring in bees and other pollinators, and you'll bring in birds and things like that, as well as having something useful for yourself too. Next slide, please. This is again the ragwort. So this is going on to the areas that aren't cultivated but are kind of forgotten areas where the species are coming back in and taking over. Next slide, please. This is just a classic example. This is some shingle. It's kind of a car park bordering on the beach. You have thistles here, you have grasses, you have plantain, which is a great food source and a really good medicinal herb. It's actually quite fashionable now as an aesthetic plant as well. So it's just classic rewilding all by itself without human intervention. Next slide, please. And this is sea lavender, a really lovely, beautiful species right out on the shingle there. So it shows that even in the most inhospitable places, plants will grow. Next slide, please. Okay, this is my allotment. So this is the last slide I've got, and it's just a summary, really. This year on my allotment, I put into practice all of these theories. I mowed paths where I needed to walk, but essentially the rest I just left be. I have a huge amount of weeds on my allotment, and I kind of embraced them this year. So I had fat hen, I had chickweed, I have horsetail, I have so many other weeds, vetches, poppies, really useful for wildlife, and I let them grow. And you can see it's messy, but the reason I wanted to include this slide is because I actually surprised myself by how much I really liked the way the allotment looked. We all think about this compromise of letting weeds grow versus having a pretty garden, and this proved to me that you actually can do both. It's not a compromise. It's a new aesthetic, it's a rougher aesthetic, but it's one that I've really enjoyed. So hopefully that's inspired people to do some rewilding, and now Helen can explain how to do it in a really lovely, organised and design-based way. Thank you, everyone.
That was wonderful. Thank you. You've given me so much confidence and so much to think about. Thank you so much, Frances. So, my art practice, making drawings and films for the last 10 years, has been about climate change and sea level rise. In that short 10 years, this has become climate crisis. So I've also become an active member of Extinction Rebellion, have been arrested, taking part in non-violent protests in London with George Monbiot and Jonathan Bartley, organised actions locally, and recently have become one of the Red Rebel Brigade. My art and activism have coalesced and developed in making my garden, taking me on a rewarding and enriching journey. From 2013, I was making the house and studios sustainable, while my suburban garden with its patch of demanding and unloved grass, narrow drive, parking space and dark evergreen shrubs glowered at me, and the temptation was just to look beyond it to the sea. But a plan formed to completely change it from boring suburbia and make it an artwork to link visually to the open sea beyond, to the harbour arm, and its connection with transport, its industrial past, to the surrounding natural vegetation, and to the wonderful light of the sea, and to make it a wildlife-friendly garden. attracting bees and butterflies, which in so many cases are declining catastrophically in number. I started drawing the plan with overlapping circles, breaking up the strong, unnatural, narrow, rectangular shapes. Apart from the geometric beauty of the circles, as I live overlooking the sea, I'm always aware of the sea, sky, moon, and sun, and that here I am on a beautiful planet. Our connection with the universe and the planet's orbits is profound, and the circles in my garden echo this. The largest circle breaks up the straight line of the drive by running through it and widens the vista. It also passes over the pond as a bridge. The circular pond is important for wildlife, but it also reflects the sky and animates the space. The paths can be a circuitous stroll to my front door, or can be a never-ending contemplative meander with no particular destination. One can take one's time and have a think, or make it part of a game, as my young grandchildren do. The third circle is made of pebbles, in reference to the beach, which is just in front of the house. I've planted a hawthorn tree at its centre to increase the vertical interest, add colour, and create a haven for the birds. Recycled railway sleepers make the pathways and the bridge, visually connecting to the Harbour Arm station, which historically used to deliver passengers on the Orient Express to their ships. The hard landscaping began in July 2018 and was the start of a journey of discovery, very hard work, some disappointment and true joy. Thank you, Rob Headley, for all your wonderful hard work. Even though the garden was very new in 2019, Kent Wildlife Trust gave it bronze in its Wildlife Garden Awards in the first year, so it was an encouraging start, and the judge gave me a lot of wonderful advice. The hard landscaping gives the garden structure so that I can be very free with the planting. At the centre of the largest circle, I've made a wildflower meadow with many species of flowers, which this year included common knapweed, oxeye daisies, wild marjoram, ragged robin, poppies, ribwort plantain, cowslips, ragged robin, bird's foot trefoil, red campion, meadow sweet, meadow crane's bill, yarrow, field scabious, and many others, plus whatever is blown in. The other parts of the garden are planted with verbena, cosmos, thrift, lavender, and of course buddleia, sea wind hardy single roses, flowering shrubs, and the beautiful dark pink hawthorn, all of which invite in the bees, butterflies, and birds. These plants survived the salty gales of the winter and did really well this summer, even though it was very dry. But I have a lot of thinking to do about the pond, which almost dried out. It needs to be deeper and have more plants to attract more pond life. But I'm told by my little boy frog spotters that the frogs survived. The garden was a visual and oral feast through the summer. And in late summer, it was a revelation, stunning as the wildflowers senesced and became lacy sculptures. Among the plants, there are bee hotels, bird feeders, and piles of rotting vegetation and wood, left in place to allow little critters to overwinter. The last 2 years have been a giant learning curve for me, but it has been hugely enjoyable. My soundscape now, in summer, is buzzing insects, birdsong, and splashing in the pond, and is a welcoming social space for my lovely human friends too. This much-loved project has given me a great sense of freedom, hope, doing something useful, and joy through lockdown, has kept me grounded and thinking of the future, which is of course why gardeners are usually firmly rooted and always learning. So that's it. Oh, I've set up a kitchen garden too. Well, I'm still learning with that. Got a lot to learn. Okay, that's me.
Thank you, Helen. It's a beautiful garden you've got there. Goes to show that the wildlife gardens can be, can look fantastic as well. Don't just have to be all overgrown.
No, I think it's the hard landscaping that helps to keep sort of inside sort of shapes. Helps with that. You can be as wild as you like if you've got a sort of geometric structure.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thanks very much. We're going to pass over to Susie now.
Hi.
Yeah.
Hi. Right, I'm Susie Ashworth from Folkestone Hobby Yarn. That's my first slide there, thank you. I dye yarns and I also look after Payer's Pocket Community Garden. Actually, this slide, which is my sort of logo, shows quite a few yarns dyed with some of the things I have grown in Payer's Pocket. So the top is the blue skein, which is woad. Then we go mugwort, which is the green. I think the yellow is tansy, and then we're moving into the madder plants, which I also grow in the garden. They produce good pinks and oranges. So we can have the next slide, which is the Payer's Pocket Garden. There we go. Yeah, so it's a very, very small space, just behind the quarter house in the heart of the Creative Quarter. I started working on it probably 2018, just making a small area for me to grow dye plants there. So I use the pocket to grow plants that can be used for natural dyeing. If I can have the next slide, actually, please. So I grow things like, there we go, it's a great big bucket of woad leaves, which are invaluable, really, because they are the only native plant that can produce blue dyes. People normally, well, have historically imported indigo from the east, but woad, which you probably know from things like Grape Hyacinth, kelp smearing themselves with it, produces, after a bit of processing, a fantastic blue colour, and I can grow it rather than have to pay for it. So that's fantastic. Next slide, please. I also use the garden as a workspace during the summer. So there's a washing line full of various bits and bobs that I have just dyed. I think there is some nettle on there. I do forage around the garden as well as growing my own plants. The bright purpley pink colour is actually bramble, so blackberries, and it didn't actually last. I didn't think it would. It actually faded to a sort of a purpley grey, but it was quite nice to see that bright colour come out. So next slide, please. So during the last lockdown, those of us who use the garden realised that most people in the area live in flats and they didn't really have an outdoor space. So we formed unofficially Payer's Pocket Community Garden, which was basically to let people know about the space and encourage them to use it. So what we have here is another organisation in Folkestone called Last Fridays. So they broadcast, they were live streaming this musician playing in the garden on the last Friday of the month. So that was really, really, really fantastic and helped people see a little bit about what we were doing. And it was just a really nice use. This lady is actually an incredibly fantastic professional musician and recording artist called Asako Morikawa, who, if you're into your classical music, most people will have heard of her. She does live in Folkestone, so it was a real honor to have her there. Yeah, so next slide, please. The other thing that we do in the garden, or that I have put in the last year, is the very grandly named Herman Memorial Little Free Library and the Pocket Gallery. So this is a miniature library. I put this in because the library was obviously closed during the last lockdown, and it has a very, very tiny little art gallery in the top, which I curate. So every 2 to 3 weeks, a new artist comes along, puts a miniature piece of artwork in there, which is quite challenging for them because it's tiny. It's about, I don't think it's about 18 centimetres wide. It's fully functional. It has its own lighting. It has a floor. But the nice thing about it is that even though it's tiny and it's cutesy, it's a cute little gallery, it's like a doll's house, people haven't put cutesy toned down artwork in there. So this one on the right was something by an artist called Charlotte Chapman, and this was her reaction to some of the political discussion and headlines regarding the first pandemic. Sorry, the first lockdown. We're still in the pandemic, but the first lockdown. But the most important thing I thought that we've done with the space, if I can have the next slide, please, is encourage wildlife. So this is a pallet structure that we built called Buckingham Palace. This is our giant bee hotel. So there's several layers there, and there are sort of succulents and things on top to sort of provide a nice to protect them from the weather. So everything in the garden, because really I have no budget, is reclaimed. It's made from things that people have chucked away, people have left. So it's not the tidiest looking garden, but this is a pile of pallets that we've transformed, and yeah, it's done really well. I think there are quite a few little critters wintering in there now. So if I can have the next slide, please. So one of the other things that we've done in the garden is we have a wildlife camera. So this is one of the young foxes having a good old sniff, seeing what we're doing. So we've got other wildlife in there as well. I think there's two main things that I've done to really encourage wildlife. Firstly, I tell everybody who uses the space that I'd like it to be a chemical-free garden. So I discourage the use of pesticides, chemicals, things like that. It's not overly manicured or controlled. We basically let things grow where they want to. Somebody put some tomatoes in the compost and I spread it out, and this year we have randomly placed tomato plants all over the place, so that's quite funny. Our centerpiece really is the compost heap. I won't show you a photo of that because nobody wants to see a big smelly compost heap, but I'm quite proud of it. We have a very small water feature, but we are going to work on that very, very soon, putting in a larger pond area. And that's about it, really. I mean, if we can see the next slide. I can't remember what this one is. There we go. That is our one tiny little water feature. It is essentially a bum on a stick, and that is a female blackbird. Again, having a look at our wildlife camera. Next slide, please. So there we go. It's a beautiful, beautiful rosemary beetle that I got a great shot of, and one of the local squirrels. I've noticed using space more and more this year, but that might just be because I'm paying attention. One of the things that I do in the garden is I use an app on my phone called Seek by iNaturalist, and if say I wasn't exactly sure about this species of beetle, but you can scan it, it'll feed back the information. It's related to WWF and National Geographic. I'm not anything like that for it, but it's really useful if you don't know what the species is. So Seek is the name of that. So yeah, that's really helpful. And I think I've repeated myself and I'm coming to the end of it. So that's it. Garden.
It's great. Thanks, Susie. We'll quickly pass on to Ginny now.
Hello. Hi. Yeah, so here's a shot of my old allotment. You can see it's rather wild, a bit like Francis's, overlooking the sea. And but unfortunately, I didn't have quite as sympathetic allotment managers as Francis obviously has. So this was the sort of beginning of my journey of rewilding. because basically the weeds would come up, and I was just very interested to see what they were instead of pulling them out. So my garden, the allotment ended up being quite wild at the end of it. So next slide, please. So yeah, I have some disabilities with mobility in my hands. So unfortunately, I haven't been able to dig and garden as much as I've wanted to. So so my gardening has sort of turned into a rewilding project. And this has become because basically I found as well, when you're in a scooter or you've got mobility issues, trying to access various areas of wild habitat, you have problems getting to them. So so I thought, well, I can just create that in my own house, and my own garden and my own allotment. And this sorry, I've just got a technical problem here. I can't see my slides for some reason on the computer. So yeah, created it at home, and this is because of, there's minimal effort there as well, which is included. And so yeah, just wondering how I can get my slides up on my phone. I'm trying to do it from my phone because my computer's not working. So yeah, if I go through the next slide, please, as well, because I can't read that one. Now here's a picture of my boat, and the containers on the boat basically would become wild with the garden, and as I've sort of travelled up and down the network on the river, then seeds would come and would fall into my pots. So I basically let them grow, and now in my own garden we have all the nature that we've sort of collected down the waterways is now in my own garden. But it's developed through having a lack of being able to garden as usual with the mobility problems. So there's I'm trying to remember what the slides are because I can't see them. So frustrating. Yeah, so when you've actually rewilding in your own garden, and it's low maintenance, you don't need to water as much as possible, because all the plants that I'm growing there are coming up by themselves, and they would be in the hedgerows. So you don't need to water the hedgerows or the grass verges. So basically you're not doing that. They're organic, and it's a sort of permaculture, and also no dig as well. So nature just takes its course at home in the garden. And next slide, please. Now I've developed a saying, don't fight the weeds, eat them. And in the picture here, you can see my favourite plant, which is a borage and Phacelia as well, which are great for attracting bees and wildlife. And there's a long list here as well of all the edible plants, wild flowers that have just naturally grown in my own garden. And they're fantastic for if you're growing an allotment as well, because they come up naturally before most of your home grown in the garden that will come up. So you're full of nutrients, and you can sort of pick them. They're best eaten in the spring, and you can cook them or just eat them fresh. So next slide, please. Now this is my wildlife pond, and I think every wild garden does need a wildlife pond. You don't have to spend much money. This is actually a builder's tub for making plaster, which has been dug in and has been filled with a bit of borrowed tadpoles from next door. So they're I sort of cheated a little bit, but and also I was gifted from a very kind lady in Folkestone as well, some newts and some other critters, and they've just sort of taken over the garden in the sense that now the wildlife are going to sort of grow through the garden. And what's best to make is some corridors from a wildlife pond, so that when you've got the little froglets, they've got a nice safe route to go to the other areas of your garden that you want them to go to. So, and you can see here there's lots of rocks for the baby newts to hide in, and also I've got lots of log piles, which then as they're rotting down, there's lots of food source for the froglets. And then they'll come back next year, and hopefully they'll sort of devour quite a lot of slugs and all of that. So you're creating a system where the predators are doing a lot of the hard work for you. So you don't need to use any herbs, pesticides, and also the natural plants that are coming up as well. They're companion plants as well, so they're good for if you do grow your vegetables in amongst these. Then there's no need to be pulling out any weeds because you're growing them. So next slide, please. Now this is my lawn, and this is another good thing for if you've got mobility problems, because you don't need to mow the lawn so often as anybody else does. So we're not having a bowling green garden. There's actually lots of species that take over, and as they're taking over, the grass is diminishing. So I've got daisies, dandelions, buttercups, and some self-heal as well in there. And also white clover, and the bees love that in the spring as well, and the hoverflies too. And there's a constant supply of dandelions, so they can be eaten as well if that's you know what your taste. So next slide, please. Now this is a garden that I inherited, moved from the boat into a flat, and as you can see, it's a monoculture. And as Francis mentioned before about the brambles, in this sort of day and age, we haven't got 1,000 years to wait for the rewilding process to take place. So this garden had just literally 4 species, which was brambles, there was sycamores that are self-seeded from a local tree, there was leylandii, and also an overgrown privet hedge. So in that sense, to create some diversity and to open up the space so that the wild flowers can then have some light to grow, you do need to sort of cut back on the species that do overgrow, especially if you've only got small space. Basically, that was a very tiny area. But in my garden, I've had sort of a bit of a fight with some brambles, but then I gave in and I thought, you know what, I've got some thornless brambles, blackberries, and some dewberries as well, and I've just let them grow now. So they have somewhere to climb up, which means that instead of obviously fighting the weeds, it's just let them grow, but you just keep them under control. And like Francis has said as well, there's some that can take over, and it's just getting some knowledge about what species are edible, and some can be quite like round elder that can sort of really take over, but you can eat that as well when they're young. So yes, don't fight the weeds, eat them. So next slide, please. And now here's some children that I've been working with and volunteering with, passing on the sort of the knowledge and the passion that I have for creating wild spaces, and to be involved in nature. Now I was inspired by my late mother, who took us on lots of walks through the countryside, and she pointed out lots of the plants that she knew. She had a love of sort of herbal plants, of the medicinal, and also, you know, ones that are beautiful as well. So I tried to sort of pass that on as well to the next generation, who are going to be our custodians of the future. And if they sort of gain a love of all the wildlife that we can attract, because it's really diminishing at, you know, quite a high speed because of the way people gardening now, that they're that people doing patios and land, you know, they're doing landscapes, and there isn't sort of space for the creatures to evolve, and that, you know, it's a knock-on effect on all the predators and the birds and the bees and the insects. So encouraging our children and taking them into nature and inspiring them and getting them to grow and look at all the insects and wildlife there, you know, it's the sort of, I think, the best thing that we can do in our lifetime, really, and sort of pass this on to the next generation. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Ginny. Thanks so much. We'll just pass on to Phil now, and after Phil, we'll open it up to discussion. So please do submit any questions you have in the chat. Over to you, Phil.
Okay, thanks, Greg. If we could have my first slide up. I'm going to whiz through this quite quickly because I know we are short on time. I've been growing plants, gardening for probably best part of 50 years or so, most of my life, and I've always combined my passions of wildlife and gardening. Unfortunately, this isn't my garden. Mine's a much smaller. My entire house and garden would fit into what you can see here. This is a garden where my partner lives. It's a communal garden, it's not hers, and I've taken over management of much of it about 2-3 years ago. It was, with the exception of cutting the lawn, the rest of it was just completely abandoned, buried under bramble and ivy and a whole load of other weeds. So the main thing I've been doing is just bringing in a variety of flowering plants to provide that nectar for the wildlife, because it is still a communal garden. Other people need to be able to use it. There's a washing line down the bottom of it. Next slide. And down the bottom, there was an old pit that at one time had been a pond, but it hasn't been for well over 20 years. So we cleared all of that, reshaped it all. Next slide. And we've lined it with carpet, just any old carpet. People are always having new carpets, so the people that are doing the work, they're more than happy to let you have it, and it just helps protect it from the underlying stones. You can see it's a reasonable sized pond, about 4 meters by 2 meters. Next slide. So as you can see, standard pond, deeper area at the front, no more than 3 foot, just under, going into a much shallower area that's about 1 foot deep, with edges that are about 6 inches deep, and an area with sandbags at the back, which is where I'm creating a wetlands, boggy area within the pond itself. Next slide. So this was it just after we'd finished and put a bit of water, a few plants in. You can see the boggy area now. Next slide. So that was all last year. This is of May 20th of May this year. You can see the bog area is coming on nicely. It's a mixture of wildflowers and natives, cultivated plants. So there's brook lime in there, which is one of the speedwells. There's a water forget-me-not. There's marsh marigold and yellow flag iris. And then the cultivated plants, I've got a cultivated form of water avens and a few different forms of the candelabra primula. A young frog, probably 2 or 3 year old, took up residence this year, and damselflies. We've got 2 species already in the garden, one of which actually hatched out, so must have been laid eggs last year. Okay, next slide. Right, just to show that size doesn't matter, unfortunately, this is the pond in my garden. You can see it's a basic preformed plastic pond, less than 1 metre wide, only just over 1 metre long. But I've had frogs breeding in it for decades, newts breeding in it for decades. Next slide. And I also get damselflies that breed in there. So any size of pond, any water is valuable. Next slide. Right, so yeah, if you do have a garden pond, be careful of leaving your back doors open in a summer evening, because you never know who's going to come wandering in. This was a surprise to me when I went to shut the door one evening. Okay, next slide. That was a note, if anybody doesn't know. Now, compost bins are also valuable, not just to provide nutrients to improve your soil, they're also a wonderful resource for the wildlife. As you can see, mine are just two basic black dustbins, but I've got a lot of long grass and rough areas and just cover around them, and that is deliberate. Now, for the next slide. What I've also done is, as well as holes drilled in the bottom to allow drainage, I've also got thumb-sized holes drilled in the sides all around it, some at ground level, some higher up. Next slide. And slow worms do use my compost bin. Over the summer, I can lift the lid and there's always there. We've got a male and female. He's not trying to eat her. He's biting the back of her head because that's actually a part of their mating process. So I think I disturbed them at an unfortunate moment. And next slide. And as I say, they do breed. I've had them for decades, and this is just a youngster. Now, as well as the slow worms, I've also been very fortunate, next slide, that on two separate occasions, I've had bumblebees nesting in this compost bin, probably because it's a little bit drier than is ideal for compost. Next slide. And as you can see, another one of the bumblebee, but there's some of the empty cases where the bumblebees have hatched out. So yeah, bumblebees and slow worms at the same time, seemingly not bothered about each other. Next slide. Now, flowers are the mainstay of any wildlife garden, I would say. Even if you can't provide habitats like ponds, wildflower meadows, woodlands, you can provide a service station in your garden for all the wildlife. Nectar and pollen they're as vital for the insects as food is to us. And don't neglect the weedy species that everybody overlooks. Dandelions, daisies, they are in flower most of the year, and you don't have to leave them to your lawn. You can use them in your flower beds as well around the front. Next slide. And if you do use natives, then meadow cranesbill here in my garden, not just a nectar source, but you're also likely to get some of the bugs and things that breed on those plants themselves. This is one that's not that uncommon around Folkestone, the cinnamon bug. And as you can see, really colourful, lovely to see, but it's much smaller. You have to get your eyes used to a much smaller level when you're looking at your garden wildlife on the whole. Okay, next slide. And another one really useful, I know Francis loves this one, Calendula, the pot marigold. Again, you can have it in flower for most of the year, and it's a lovely landing pad for bees, flies, butterflies to just come and take their drink. Okay, next slide. Now, the main thing is to provide a continuity of flowers to provide that nectar and pollen throughout the year, not just in the summer. So late winter into spring is the really important time. So we've got the snowdrops and winter aconites. This is in January this year. Like I say, not my garden, unfortunately. And next slide, please. And then, so yeah, you've got the winter, the spring bulbs, the bulb irises and primroses are coming out this early February. Next slide. Next slide, please. And then late March, the primroses, they're still going really strongly, but also you've got wallflowers are out, and the narcissi, the daffodils, are still going strong. And next slide, please. And don't forget some of the out of fashion plants, hyacinths, wonderful splash of colour for your garden, and they also fill the garden with scent. And that really is important. Don't forget scent in your garden. Next slide, please. And again, the grape hyacinth, another wonderful plant, doesn't take up much space, great nectar source early in the year. Okay, next slide, please. And the other thing with any gardening, don't forget to create space for yourself. Whether you like to sit on an old wooden stump, whether you need a proper bench or a seat, find somewhere you can just relax, chill out, and let the cares of the world drift away. As you can see, that's something my cat has got down to a T. Okay, I think that'll do me, Greg.
Thanks, Phil. That's great. Right, we'll open this up to all of us now. I think we'll get stuck straight in with some questions. So we've got a question from Nicola Dunsby. What would you recommend as the first step for anyone in rewilding their garden?
Well, I would say that Helen had it really with the hard landscaping. It sounds really counterintuitive, but if you're going to have a space that's usable for you, then you need to really structure it well so that it looks intentional, because it's really interesting hearing the feedback of other people. You know, as Ginny was saying with her allotment, I've had the same from mine, not from the people who are actually in charge of it, but from other allotment holders coming and telling me what I should be pulling up. And then when you actually speak to them and discuss it with them about certain species, I've had it where I've turned up to my allotment and there's a group of older men all standing around my weeds going, "Oh, did you know?" And one of them's telling the others, and they're all going, "Oh, that's really interesting." So I think it's that thing of like, if you want acceptance from the public, or if you want acceptance from yourself or your neighbours, then creating a really strong and dynamic structure in which to house your whatever weeds you want to grow and whatever wild species you want to grow looks intentional. So it's that kind of dressing to the space, I think, before you even then get onto the species and other things like that, I think is the first step.
That's great. And we've got a question from Hazel Sargent. Are there any plants that you would recommend for bats?
Anything that attracts insects, really. I mean, that's what they feed on. So they're just going to need anything that is going to attract bees, bugs, things that are going to fly at night. I watch them in Payers Park all the time, the bats. So I think what they need for hunting as well, they need a bit of a nightlight to attract the insects. And they obviously need a small but dry roost, which I think is in one of my neighbour's roofs. But anything that encourages a wide range of insects.
I've just got something a bit controversial to suggest as well. When I lived on a boat in the marina, we had a lot of black bats that would fly around in the night time, but they'd be after the mosquitoes and the gnats. So it's a bit counterintuitive to actually encourage gnats and mosquitoes by sort of having some water source that's like in your water butts and stuff as well. So you might not like going out in the evenings because you get bitten, but it would encourage the bats as well, and also swallows as well. They like to and swifts. They get attracted to when there's a lot of those around.
I think the bat encouragement is a really nice thing too, as a kind of whole concept for rewilding as a plus, because like you say, you like to sit out and watch them in the evenings, but also you can really enrich that environment for them by having night scented plants, like night scented stocks, evening rose, Trachelospermum, Magnolia grandiflora, Nicotiana. There are loads of pale coloured, highly scented evening or nighttime scented species, which will bring insects to your garden, and that will bring the bats to your garden. And then you as a gardener can sit in the evenings and actually just enjoy that environment of the scents and the sounds and the sights of the wildlife that's coming in. So it's a really nice holistic approach as to why we even do this.
Right. And we've got a question from Mitchell Bloomfield, who asks, how do you actually identify plants whilst you're out and about?
There's a huge range of wildflower guides. Probably many botanists, then their plant bible would be Francis Rose, the wildflower key. But it's the main thing is just don't try and learn everything at once. Go out, recognise a few plants, find out what they are. There's a flower guide, there's a huge range of them. But yeah, just start to learn a few things, and then when you go out, always constantly remind yourself of those, and then just gradually add a couple more. And it's it takes time. It takes a lifetime. Nobody ever knows everything. So, and if you try and do too much at once, you end up remembering nothing. So it's better to remember 2 or 3, gradually add to them than try and do too much at once.
Cool. And Cherry
There is a
Tulip.
smartphone app.
Sorry, go on, Susan.
Sorry. I do, but there is a smartphone app which identifies almost everything. I've not paid by them, I promise. I think it's brilliant. So you basically point the camera at yourself and it will, oh, hang on, it's just showing my finger. Sorry. So it's going to start identifying me as a human in a minute. It acts as, so there you go. There I am. I'm a human. That it has identified me. It's called Seek. You can download it for free. I find it really, really useful. It does plants, animals, insects, creepy crawlies, everything.
Yeah,
This is my
technology sometimes myself.
And Cherry Tulip.
You have to be. Oh, can I just button? You do have to be careful with some of those apps, because I've found there was a couple of apps that I had and I ended up educating it instead of the other way around, because they'd keep getting them wrong. So I had to keep sort of uploading my photos and telling them what the species were. So it's don't call it as gospel when they do tell you what the plant is, because it could be something else as well. So if you're thinking of eating something as well, be very, very careful, because it might get that wrong.
Yeah, that is true, because a lot of species, plants and insects, the difference between different species is minute little details that a photo can never really show.
I think it's quite nice with all these things to actually, I know at the moment with lockdown restrictions, we can't all get out and meet other people. But if you know a person who is good at anything like this, then that human knowledge is really, really, you can't beat it. You go out with a person who's a mycologist and they'll, you pick up a mushroom and they'll go, oh no, because if you look at this, and they'll know the little telltale signs to look for, whether something has hairs on the stems or doesn't, if it's sticky or if it's not, if it has slight spots on it or if it doesn't, these tiny little signatures that will tell you whether something's something you can eat or something that's poisonous, that you can read in a book, but you may miss. Whereas if you go out with a person and they can tell you those things, you really get that interactive knowledge about species, I think.
Yeah.
Great. So Cherry Tulip asks, she'd love to hear from Frances about what she thinks about the need for balancing rewilding approach on the one hand with the urgent need to cultivate more edible plants in our growing spaces, and is it possible to do both?
Yes, I think it is possible to do both. I think it's a really, well, we've had lots of discussions about this, and with Helen saying about her kind of activism environmentally, I think there's a huge call to increase wildlife numbers, as gardeners, as custodians of land, and that includes farmers and councils and anyone else who has the say-so about what happens to the land that we work on, to increase our wildlife numbers, our diversity, but also to take the pressure off air miles of the food that we import, to grow our own things. We're all feeling the pinch with finances at the moment, so if we can grow our own food for that as well, it's all really important. It's this sort of circular system that we have to think about how every one of our actions as gardeners can have an environmental impact. So I would say it's totally possible. Mine and Ginny's allotment show, I assume Ginny was growing food as well, that we've all been taught this set way of gardening that we have to weed everything that's not supposed to be there. And there's never a reason why, a weed, unless it's something like a bramble or something that's going to actually take over and outcompete your crops. There's no reason why we should be digging up something like a fat hen that's growing in between your sweet corn, as mine was this year, and you can eat fat hen. So actually there is an argument for growing weeds, cultivating weeds that will add to your food as well. Chickweed is really highly nutritious and delicious. It's annual, so it doesn't take over too much. It's good ground cover, so it provides for things like ground beetles. So there are loads of things that we can grow in amongst our crops, as long as we have to just change the way that we think about the aesthetic of our crops. We imagine for some reason that vegetable gardening should be in straight lines and it should be bare soil and really neat. And there is no reason why that's the case, as opposed to ornamental gardening. We need to rethink the way that we grow our veg and be a little bit less precious about how we do it. Also put in a lot less chemical interventions. digging a lot less, because actually there's been loads of studies that you get higher yields with no dig veg gardens than you do if you're digging and disturbing that subsoil ecosystem every time. So it's just changing the way that we do our veg gardening to actually increase production whilst allowing a bit of natural species, whether they are animal, insect or plant or fungus, to exist at the same time. So yeah, definitely it's possible, and definitely I would encourage everyone to do it.
Great. And we've got one more question from Andrew South. District Council manages the flower beds across the district, which are very pretty but useless for wildlife. Is there a better way to have beds managed using colourful plants and shrubs for wildlife?
Guerrilla gardening, Helen.
Let's have wildlife everywhere. Let's have wildflowers. There's nothing more beautiful than wildflower meadows.
I actually took a photograph on my tour of some of the planters down on Folkestone Harbour, and I decided not to send them over because I didn't want to be too critical of certain ways of doing it. But I totally agree. There are things like pelargoniums, which are beautiful but have virtually no wildlife benefits, as opposed to the cranesbills, the native geraniums, which do. So it's the aesthetic versus the practical. But also there are further reaching kind of implications of it, because if we're having bedding schemes every year, then we're buying in that bedding from who knows where. The compost is from who knows where. Is it peat based? Probably. Has it been treated with chemicals? Probably. Has it been flown in from Holland via South Africa? Probably. So actually, if we're growing perennials, growing wildflowers, we're not having to import all that extra stuff and adding to the environmental burden of everything as well. So there are loads of arguments for rethinking public bedding schemes.
Yeah, my cranesbill is still flowering now. It's absolutely stunning. It's been there from right through as well. There's not so much work involved. I cut my wildflower meadow once this year, taken away the cuttings because you can't enrich the soil for wildflower meadows. You have to keep it poor, which means again you don't have to use chemicals, you don't have to use mulch, you don't have to, all that work is taken away. Then you collect the seeds for next year, and it's self-perpetuating. It's a beautiful thing to watch.
Yeah, the council would save so much money if they didn't keep mowing the grass verges as well, and they seem to do it at the wrong time when the wildflowers are all, all in bloom, and they're just about to set seeds as well. So and they're so beautiful. It'd be lovely if the council would just leave them to it. Really.
Yeah, I would just say that there are things that could be done better. Obviously, on the flip side, some of the verges do, for safety reasons, do need some mowing. But yeah, it is definitely done too often and at the wrong times very often. But the other thing is, largely to some extent, councils are a bit dinosaurs, but also they are very much driven by the perception of the public. It's the public very often that complain when verges aren't being mown. So it's the public that needs to get a different mindset. And the more people tell the council not to mow them, or could they do that? So councils largely respond to the feedback from the public. So the more people ask them not to do these or to change things, then maybe things can change. It's down to us.
I know one or two of the people who work for the council who are actually activists in wildflower regeneration, and they're working very hard to be able to do it. They've just got to persuade the people who make the decisions to let them.
Yeah,
I think they're on our side, actually. A lot of them.
It's so true that we can all be activists. In my book at the very end, I put a little thing, and I thought that the publishers would cut it, but they were really happy about it. That we all individually have the power to be activists, and it can be the smallest thing as writing a letter to your local councilman, shaming them even and saying, look, you mowed the verge, you cut the hedge in the middle of nesting season, and just saying, I don't want you to do this. I want to put my voice to that argument that I appreciate the wildflower, I appreciate the biodiversity that's happening. And then, like you say, they will respond. So we can all play a really huge role in that. And with local farmers and anyone else that we see, that we can go, actually, I don't need you to do this, so maybe we shouldn't. And they'll probably thank us because it costs them a lot less money to do less maintenance.
Well, as an XR activist, we have worked with our local council to remind them what they promised to do on their year anniversary of declaring a climate emergency. And it did remind them. And it helps, I think it helps the people who are working with green issues to say, but look, we're being kept an eye on here. We're, you know, we're strengthening the people who want to work the way that we're suggesting.
Definitely.
So it's worth doing it.
Well, it's all about feedback. I think there's a lot of talk about that in gardening circles and in general. You know, it's lovely to start community projects. It's lovely to start these ideas, but there also needs to be a sort of assessment of how those ideas are working, whether they're working, how they can be improved, holding people to account about the things that they've started, so that we can all progress in a really constructive way as they go on into the future, and assess how we can really hone this to, as Ginny said, inspire the next generation of gardeners and eco-warriors, local people who are using spaces. So it's all about communication, I think, and working together in collaboration rather than fighting people to have a real understanding about how these things are working and how better they could work for everyone and for the natural world. So it's really nice to hear all these people who are so actively kind of involved in this. It's inspiring, I think.
Yeah, I can feel an urban room project coming on here.
One other thing I would just add on that is I think, as well as just letting the councils know what they're doing wrong and complaining, it's also important that we let them know when they're doing something right. Send them praise for the things we do approve of, because all organisations, they're so used to hearing complaints from people, it almost just washes over their head. They don't hear it. And whereas praise, you know, that goes a long way, and that is something that they will take note of, probably more than complaints. So let them know what they're doing right as well as just what they're doing wrong.
Great. Well, I think we'll probably call it there. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've learned a lot.
Yeah, too.
Going away inspired.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.